You just heard Situation Vacant, and Something Else by the Kinks is the second Kinks album that we're covering. We covered them initially way back in the early days of the podcast in episode 2, so you can check that out if you want the bio. But two things that I do want to bring up from past history that are relevant here. In that episode, I talked about how the Kinks sort of had 5 distinct periods of their career. This would fall in what I consider to be period number 2, and that is the period that was considered to be when Ray Davies was making songs that were observational in style about English life in particular. They were softer rock albums, and they were sometimes called their golden era. Now that followed the British Invasion 3-chord garage rock that is the first version of them, and then the third version and the longest one, which is where they started releasing a series of concept albums and rock operas, which we're going to get to some of them later in the 60s, but also a little bit in the 70s. And those are famously critically acclaimed, if not great sellers. The other thing that defines this period, the second period of the Kinks, is the fact that, if you remember correctly, guys, they were banned from America for a long period of time by the American Federation of Musicians, which still, as we've talked about before, is kind of a mystery as to what happened. There's a bunch of different stories, but this falls in the period where they were only really playing, outside of the United States market. So obviously that has a huge effect on their sales because they're not able to tour and support their albums in the way that all the rest of the major British bands were. Another thing that's important context for this album is, and it's interesting we cover the Kinks and the Who back to back because the Kinks are very similar to the Who in the fact that they are releasing a bunch of singles that are as well known as most of the tracks on a lot of their albums. Autumn Almanac, Dedicated Follower of Fashion, there's a whole bunch of different ones. In fact, on the Twitter account, @CombingThe, for those that want to follow along, I actually put up 5 tracks from the Who and 5 tracks from the Kinks around the same time and said who, no pun intended, who had a better set of singles at this time. And there were some folks that weighed in on that, so thanks to those that weighed in on it. But the Kinks are just plowing out singles to go along with albums.
Yeah, those singles are so good too.
They really are, and it's shocking to me that the song Autumn Almanac is not on this album. They released it after this album kind of bombed as a single to try to get airplay, and it fits thematically and sound-wise pretty much perfectly into this album. Kind of like I said, Pictures of Lily would have fit perfectly on the Who Sell Out last week, so it's just very interesting in terms of what goes on to an album and what doesn't.
Well, it was such a different time, too, right? There was a different focus than there is today. You wouldn't really think about doing it, at least not to the extent that they were doing it in the 60s, which for the Who and the Kinks was totally, let's not put any singles on albums, so it was a very different approach.
So a couple things about this album before we talk about it. Number one is it's pretty much talked about a lot that this album doesn't sound like almost anything else in 1967. It's very, very British. And I'm not talking British accent or anything. The concepts of the songs, what they're commenting on, come distinctly from a British viewpoint as opposed to a world viewpoint, especially sort of a combination of what I guess we would call like a suburban viewpoint nowadays and sometimes a pastoral viewpoint. And this is also when Ray Davies, and actually Dave Davies does write 2 songs on this album, Death of a Clown and Love Me Till the Sun Shines, which are actually 2 of the songs I like a whole lot on this album. So that's an interesting change of pace. But because one of the reasons it doesn't sound like anything else from 1967 is because this is the first album that Ray Davies ever produces for the Who, or for the Kinks, for the Kinks. Before that, Shel Talmy was doing their albums, and he's a pretty well-known producer of a variety of different groups. But Ray Davies actually, in looking back at this, did not love the production work he did on this, and he felt that it was the songs that they had, probably his words were a more mundane approach would have been better, and he felt he kind of went a little bit too big for the material. It's kind of funny to talk about Ray Davies saying that they went too big considering like where the next 5 or 6 albums go, these, sprawling, concept albums and rock pieces. I think also interestingly enough, No Return on this album is their attempt at doing bossa nova, which will be very fitting for the last segment.
I was going to say that.
Yeah.
Yep. So for some context, when we talked there, that was them attempting to do bossa nova, a genre that segment 3 will, I'm sure, go into quite a bit. Some of Nicky Hopkins, who we've talked about quite a bit, he is well known for playing with The Who and the Stones. He's the keyboardist on this album. There's a lot of keyboards. And Ray Davies' wife, Rasa, is singing the backing vocals on many of the songs. That's quite a bit. I mean, this album did not do very well. One of the reasons that it was considered to have not done well is it was competing against their singles albums, which were selling pretty well, especially overseas. And also, the Kinks were considered to be too old and established for the teeny bopper audience, but also not, but too cool and modern for an older audience. So they felt like they were kind of stuck in between two worlds. There's a pretty famous story where they were playing 20-minute sets for Peter Frampton's band called The Herd, and a bunch of teenage girls basically were having, like, trying to basically yell them off the stage to get to Peter Frampton's band, and it led to them not touring for a very long time afterwards. That was in the aftermath
because they were so upset by that, or like
they weren't upset. They just said, kind of, what's the point of this? And they became more of a studio rock band. That's when they started doing the concept albums. Yeah. So the last thing I'll say is that the guitar tone and sound of this album is also talked about. It was created by what's called a tape delay echo effect, and Ray Davies and Dave Davies kind of laughed that it was considered to be new and revolutionary, but it was really just used quite a bit in the 50s for guitar tone, especially for pop songs. But no one had used it in so long because it was considered, not cool anymore, that by the time they used it again in 1967 in another context, they said that people thought it was new again, which was funny. And they thought it was kind of instructive to, like, what people listened to, because, in the mid-50s, people were using this all the time, and yet people weren't able to recall it. So that's a little bit of it. Matt, let's start with you. What'd you think of this album?
So I like this record. I liked it better than the last Kinks record that we heard.
Face to Face, for reference. Yep.
Face to Face, and that was our second episode, I think.
Yes.
So I think that this was more consistent, and there were two songs on this that, from the get-go, I loved right away. My favorite on this record include "Death of a Clown."
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Which
written
is
by Dave Davies. Yep.
Yes. Yeah. And it's a very, I don't know the way to describe it. It's just like it's like that. They have a very cool acoustic guitar part that's going on, and it's just got a very infectious and catchy, chorus and verses too. It's just a very cool song. Plus, I hate clowns, so anytime a clown dies, I'm all for it.
Oh man. Matt
who
fact.
likes clowns? That's just clowns. Right?
Strong take.
Yeah.
Strong take. Die, clowns. Die.
Whoa.
You're going to die, clown. The other song that I really, really liked, and probably my favorite on this record, is Harry Rag. It's like I feel like you're listening to that song and you're like in a bar like back in the 1800s with a bunch of sailors, and they're just like stomping their feet, and like it's a very cool sounding song to me, and it's just got a very, again, very catchy chorus. It's got a cool bass line, got a good bass line going on in there. And if I'm not mistaken, it's about smoking a cigarette, right, John?
It is.
Yep.
Yeah. Just about, give me a cigarette, man. My life might suck, but as long as I got a cigarette called
Well,
Harry
they write
Rag.
about ordinary parochial issues, to the point where the Kinks were actually criticized for writing a variation of the same song consistently. And so Ray Davies said, well, I'll show you fucking something, and then released a bunch of concept albums in a row, basically because of that criticism. So,
well, and again, I'm listening more for the music, but I think that I liked the first half of this record better than the second overall. It took me.
How can you say that about an album that has Waterloo Sunset on the back end? Of
yeah,
the
that's
album?
a good question. I think that I like that song, and I've also heard people hail that as being one of their best songs. I think Rhett Miller from the Old 97 says he thinks it's the best song that was ever written. Period. Not just the best Kinks song. So and I think he covered it as well. I like it. I don't see the genius of it. I'm not like, oh my god, that song's amazing. I do like it, but to me it's a little bit overhyped. But I think that as a whole, the album is very good. I don't think there's really anything that's weak on here that I'm going, I don't like this at all. There's certainly some tracks I like better than others, but I think it was a more consistent effort than Face to Face, and. Yeah, I also liked. The other Dave Davies song was really "Love Me Till the Sun Shines." I think that was more of a standout for me too. I liked that, but yeah, it's good. I like it.
This album is great.
Yeah.
There are so many catchy songs on this album. Like, I was going to ask, like, what is your favorite song on this album? Because there's, like, 4 favorite songs on this album for me.
I agree with you, Josh, but just to weigh in. Yep.
The songcraft is so good. It's 36 minutes. It breezes by. Almost everything has a catchy hook or, like, a really good, like Death of a Clown, like you said, Matt. That's a great song. David Watts. Who is David Watts? I don't care because I'm just singing the song. And I love Tin Soldier Man. I love Afternoon Tea. I love Waterloo Sunset. It's a testament to their writing and how I guess maybe underappreciated or at the time. I don't know how appreciated they are now, but that they just craft solid, awesome like rock songs and pop songs. So
I think David Watts was a dude that he went to high school with, or something like that, or maybe represented somebody that he went. He to was high school
a representative.
With.
He was he was a sketch. Yep, for sure. I think that probably the worst take on this entire podcast in the 15-episode run is Matt saying, Waterloo Sunset's a pretty good song, but I just don't really see what Waterloo Sunset's almost a perfect pop song. I'd like to say the Kinks were as good a singles band as any band in the 60s, and I'd argue one of the best singles bands ever. And Waterloo Sunset might be their best single of all of their singles. So I think in terms of underplaying a song, I would say that, whether you feel it or not, like the crafting of Waterloo Sunset is almost a perfect pop song. We haven't even mentioned Situation Vacant yet, which I love in terms of the structure of it. As Josh said, it's just one good song after another. Another thing about this album is every time you listen to it, it gets better and you start to see a little bit more of the complexity music-wise in it. I listened to it 3 times, and each time I listened to it, I picked up on other stuff. The Kinks master that idea of crafting songs that can sound simple the first time you listen, and then you go back and you hear them, and they're way more complex than you realize they were. The tone of the guitars on this album, I don't know why Ray Davies didn't love his production, because I actually thought it was really well produced. But the sound of the album and the layering was excellent. And I know, Matt, you're not a big lyrics guy, but the lyrics are alternatingly funny and very evocative. You can get a picture in your head. As you said, like Harry Rag, you got a picture, right? You told it right there. And I almost look at the way Ray Davies writes songs, and he would describe it this way, I think, too. He does sketches of things, but they aren't necessarily about concrete things. It's about ideas. Like Waterloo Sunset is sort of him. He's said different things over time, but it's basically about him viewing these two this actor and actress who are dating in British pop culture and imagining them like in a romance scene or like them on a date or something like that. And he kind of writes from that perspective, slightly detached observer. And I really love the way his songs come together and build to the choruses. I do like it better than Face to Face. Face to Face, as Kinks albums go, is kind of in the middle for me, but I think this is a definitive step up in terms of the quality of the songs, and easy recommend for me.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you. I think I saw more into it the more I listened to it, and I think that for me, the first side overall was something that I gravitated towards more, and it hit me more initially. And I appreciated the second half the more I listened to it. But I would agree with that. There is a lot going on here, and I like it a lot. I don't know what to say about Waterloo Sunset. It's a great song. It's not like I'm going, holy crap, it's the most amazing thing I've ever heard. I'm just not there.
Yeah. I think what John said struck something for me about it being seeming simple at first and being more complex when you listen to it, because I agree with that. I think the first time you listen to it, you say, okay, yeah, I see what they're doing. It's not that, I've heard it before or something, but then when you start listening to it more, it reveals itself.
Well, we just talked about Van Halen, right? And that's a trademark of Eddie Van Halen. I think you hear a song like Panama, and it's like, boy, you don't need much of a brain to figure out what this is about, but then you isolate the stuff Eddie Van Halen's doing on the guitar solos and stuff like that, and the complexity of it, and you're like, boy, this is a pop song, and it has this layer of artistic complexity to it. And the Kinks, I feel, have always walked that line as a band, and I think that's why they're always considered to be sort of an underappreciated band. And once again, I can't stress enough that them not having a foothold in America when there's a lot of nostalgia for other bands, I think has always robbed the Kinks a little bit of their street cred in terms of mainstream press. They've always been celebrated by critics, and certainly musicians love the Kinks, but I think, mainstream appeal, you got to wonder if they had those 5 years back. I don't see how they wouldn't have had a bunch of hits.
Yeah, they just seemed like they had like some things that were just going against them, right? They just had a string of bad luck, in terms of timing or getting banned. I don't know if other artists were like overshadowing them because they, took advantage of being able to do those things that they weren't. But no, they're good, and it's certainly they're certainly a band that I'm glad that we're covering, because I've known about them for many years, but it's never been something again where I've really delved into their stuff, or really got to the point where it's like I felt like I knew their stuff, because I think the only song I knew going into this was Waterloo Sunset. Probably I know their singles a lot more than what we're hearing in these records, which makes sense. But John, was this, so you're saying that Davies was maybe not satisfied with the production, and maybe some of the critics, kind of being critical of what he was writing about, to go into more of a concept album, I guess, because I guess the next is the Village Green Preservation Society. Mm-hmm. So was he not happy with this record? Were critics not happy? Like, what was the overall take?
It didn't sell well. And like I said, after this, they went on a tour that they were reluctant to pursue to begin with, and then they were really disillusioned. And at the time, the Kinks were considered to be a band that had its time, right? They weren't cool anymore. There was a thought that they'd lost their mojo to some degree. And then, they enter this period afterwards where they do Village Preservation Society, and they're critically acclaimed, but they're still not selling well. And then they do the concept album with Lola, right? Lola in 1970. Mm-hmm. That song hits as almost like a novelty act in America, but then it sort of reinvigorates interest in the Kinks, and they start selling a little bit better. And keep in mind that at this point, they're no longer enforcing that ban, so they can play in the United States. And so then throughout the 70s, they become really late 60s and most of the 70s, they become that band that's known for these sprawling concept albums. But yeah, that was directly the result of a conscious change of direction by Ray Davies, the songwriter, and in terms of how he was putting music together.
But so Davies' only criticism of this album for him was just his production. He still stood by the songs, pretty much, you think, or what they were trying to do?
I think so. Yeah, I think. Yeah. He's always observational, and he's always sketch of life in all of his writing throughout all of the different versions of the Kinks. So that doesn't really change. I think it's just more. He becomes a little bit less parochial to like a certain type of character sketch, and moves into a more general set of character sketches. That's the best way I can describe it. It becomes less moored in a certain type of Englishman and more in universal themes. Like Lola's about a transvestite, right? So it's like, he goes in a different direction, gets a little bit more edgy. The Kinks, unlike the Who are more overt in the sexual overtones of it, the Kinks music has a lot of like ambiguity in terms of sexuality in it, and we'll visit them at other times, but I would kind of urge you guys, especially as we start listening to the concept albums, that's kind of a theme that comes up quite a bit, this sort of ambiguity in the lyrics, to go along with a mundane, traditional way of viewing the world as well, often juxtaposed against each other. So, and one thing you'll be interested in, Matt, is you love the Pretty Things. And actually, a member of the Pretty Things, Gordon Edwards, actually becomes a bassist for the Kinks later on. So
I was just going to ask, because I think I remember you saying in the first episode we covered them that they changed over, like Ray Davies and Dave Davies stayed the same core, but then they transferred their bass player and drummer a lot. So were these the same guys as the previous record? Is this where's their
this was a couple guys quit after this album because they felt kind of the critical success was just not going to come. So a couple members of the band, then they reconfigured the band for the next era, and that's kind of why I describe it as Era 3. That's not a formal thing. It's not critics saying this is Era 3 of the Kinks. It's just in my head. Yeah. I look at it. And the other thing too is I don't mean to keep going back to Van Halen, but a big piece of Van Halen is they covered the Kinks twice and did a real good job on them with You Really Got Me and Where Have All the Good Times Gone.
Did.
You Really Got Me is on the Van Halen 1, and Where Have All the Good Times Gone is the first track on Diver Down. And they're both awesome covers that are different than the original. So
that's the other thing. Van Halen was a great cover band. They
Yeah.
were so good.
Sure.
they sure were.
Yeah. Now let me ask you this before we wrap this up. Like, I think that's an interesting concept because when you think about bands who have rotating members, you know, like a band like Oasis for all those years, you know, they seem to like flux. You know, it's just the two brothers, and then you have all these other people, and they were clearly difficult personalities to work with. And I got to think that if that's happening in a band, maybe they're not happy with the success, but it's got to lend some credibility to the fact that maybe these two brothers are really hard to work with. I would assume that would be part of it too. If you keep rotating band members, it's got to speak to like those people being hard to work with, doesn't it?
I don't know if they were more hard
is that
to
true,
work.
John, for these guys?
I don't know if they were considered more hard to work with than other temperamental musicians, but I think a lot of musicians are not easy people to work with, especially if you consider the band to be the titular head of the band, right? You know, and you have that ownership. There's always sort of, this is my band, and if you're seeing my mission, you can stay, and if not, you know, get lost, basically.
Right.
So,
right.
Yep. But I mean, I don't read about them being uniquely difficult to get along with. I mean, you can go back to our earlier episode, but there's a lot of funny stories about the Kinks during this time, and recordings of different stuff and concept albums, and, you know, sort of their general crankiness at different times. But I didn't get the feeling that people left because they had falling outs with the Davies brothers. I think a lot of the people leaving during this time were like, I don't think we're ever going to break it like the other British bands because we can't play in America, right? So I'll go back to doing this other gig. Later on, I think they probably did become a little bit harder to work with. In the 70s, you do hear a little bit more of that. And I know they're territorial of their songwriting and protecting it, but I don't know. I mean, I can look into it, Matt, but it doesn't come up in terms of literature.
I was just curious, you know, because it very well could be that, like, you know, it makes sense. We're not making any money. We could be doing better things. But it strikes me whenever I see that with a band, I'm like, oh, man, it was like these two guys and then a bunch of other people. It's like, it just would stand to reason that might be part of it. But I could be mistaken here. Yeah.
Yep. All right. I think it's